J.D. Vance thought a slogan would win red states pay, blue states play. But Jasmine Crockett's red folder told a deadlier story proof that left 42 million viewers stunned. When facts hit the table, whose America collapsed, stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. C-SPAN was live at steady camera, locked on the Senate Budget Committee chamber, a room built on authority lined with mahogany, heavy with silence. On paper, the topic looked dull, money gaps between Republican red states and Democrat blue states. But the air inside was charged. Senator J.D. Vance sat easy at the center of the panel fingers, drumming the mic like he was setting up a joke. Then with a sly half-smile, he leaned in California lives off the kindness of Mississippi. The words dropped like smoke. The reaction was instant. A wave of smug laughter rippled from the Republican side, quiet chuckles rising into loud amusement. A few slapped the table. One leaned back, shaking his head as if it was obvious. The line wasn't just sharp, it was meant to sting, to turn millions of Americans into a punchline about dependence and worth. The cameras held their ground. They moved slow, searching, sweeping until they found Jasmine Crockett. She sat still, not idle. Her left hand rested on a red folder, its thick tabs worn from use clearly ready. Her face didn't shift. No grin, no glare. Just a calm, steady silence that weighed more than shouting ever could. Her eyes locked on Vance, not surprised, focused. And then without raising her tone, she answered kindness. She echoed, tasting the word like ash. Or is it theft, hidden in the fine print of tax loopholes? The chamber froze. The laughter cut like a needle off vinyl. Crockett didn't blink. Her hand stayed on the folder. She didn't need to move. Her words hit harder than volume. This wasn't charity, she suggested. It was theft in plain sight. And for the first time that morning, J.D. Vance lost his smile. The silence after Crockett's last words wasn't empty. It was heavy, like the pause before a sniper pulls the trigger. It wasn't silence asking to be filled. It demanded payback. J.D. Vance, calm but never idle, tugged at his cuff as if he had been waiting for that very line, that very moment to strike. He leaned into the mic, his voice low but cutting, sharp as a blade. "Let's not twist reality," he said, letting the words sting in the air. "Because the data doesn't lie." At his signal, an aide switched on the wall monitor, and within seconds, a glowing chart lit up the chamber. Bold, polished, ready color-coded by state, every bar crisp and clear. The room locked in as if the numbers themselves had stepped into the fight. The screen spoke in brutal clarity. Green bars rose tall over Mississippi, Kentucky, and Alabama, each tagged federal aid received per capita. In contrast, California and New York showed much smaller bars, neat and restrained. The picture was strong, and J.D. Vance knew it. He shifted slightly in his chair, turning just enough to face the press and the Democrats across the aisle. "You see," he said, his pen drawing invisible lines in the air, "this isn't opinion. It's math." His tone grew harder. "The so-called high-tax coastal elites take billions more in handouts than they give. That's not fairness. That's dependence." Then he turned slowly, locking eyes with Jasmine Crockett. The pause before his next line was sharp, intentional. "Tell me, Congresswoman, what does your district live on, if not the taxes my voters provide?" There it was. Not a question, but an accusation. Behind him, Republican senators nodded quietly, smirks spreading like a shadow through the chamber. He had spun the story: the South as provider, the North and West as beggars. The jab carried not just scorn, but precision, the kind meant to crush years of work into a single chart. Staffers typed furiously. Viewers at home saw the headline form in real time: Vance to Crockett, who pays for you? The trap was set, and he believed she had no escape. But Crockett stayed still. She didn't speak, didn't flinch. Her fingers stayed on the red folder. Her face stayed calm, focused, exact. Then without a word, she slid her left hand to her bag. The motion was slow, careful, like a soldier drawing a weapon in a fragile truce. From a narrow pouch, she pulled a small silver USB drive, its surface flashing under the lights like steel. The moment she raised it, the chamber seemed to hold its breath. Without breaking her stare, she stood. Her heels echoed 1, 2, 3 on the marble as she walked to the AV console. No drama, no show, just the click of metal sliding in. The monitor went black. A flicker, then a pulse. Loading supplemental fiscal data. Source U.S. Treasury GAO. Crockett returned to her seat without a word, crossed her legs, and finally softly delivered the line no one expected. Let's talk about the part of the math you left out. The moment Crockett said, let's talk about the part of the arithmetic, you left out, the whole hearing room seemed to hold its breath. No one spoke. Then the screen that had shown J.D. Vance's chart flickered once, twice, and came back on with a completely new map. This one wasn't about politics. It was about numbers that mattered. A bright, detailed map of the U.S. filled the screen. Each state glowed in different colors, green, gold, or blue, based on how much they contributed to the national economy, their GDP, the total federal taxes they paid, and the number of jobs they created in the last 10 years. This data wasn't from some blog, it came straight from the U.S. Treasury and Labor Department. It was official. It was real. California glowed, the brightest, lit up in gold, as if the screen could barely handle how much it produced. New York followed close behind, then Illinois, Massachusetts, and Washington all shining. These were the top states funding America. At the bottom of the screen, a sentence appeared in bold white letters: top 5 states contributing to federal revenue, 62.3% combined. There was no shouting, no commentary, just numbers that couldn't be ignored. The whole room went quiet. Jasmine Crockett walked toward the screen. Her footsteps echoed in the stone hall. Calm and steady, she pointed at the data. This, she said clearly and firmly, is who funds this country. She pointed to California and New York on the glowing map. GDP, tax revenue. Employment engines, she continued. The backbone of federal income doesn't come from charity, it comes from creation. Behind her, the screen changed again, showing a new chart comparing what each state gave in taxes and what they got back from the government. Vance, who had looked confident before now, sat back in silence, his pen resting in front of him. He wasn't smiling anymore. You want to pretend that your states prop up the nation, she asked, looking straight at him. Then explain why the very states you mock are the same ones underwriting the hospitals, the highways, and the farm subsidies you claim as homegrown pride. Her voice was calm and steady, but each word hit hard. This is who's doing the lifting, not based on feelings, based on facts. The screen showed one final chart. A row of bars on the left were states that give more than they receive. On the right, states that take more than they give. The contrast was impossible to argue with. Suddenly, a Republican senator shouted across the room, "That's a misleading graph, and you know it." But Crockett didn't blink. She kept her arm raised. Her voice didn't rise. She said coldly, "I'm not finished." That short sentence shut the room down. The senator fell quiet. Crockett turned back to the screen and spoke again. For too long, this narrative, this lie has been repeated, that the places with diversity, complexity, and poverty are leeches, that we take while you give. But the numbers say otherwise. At that moment, the energy in the room shifted, not just in attention, but in power. Crockett wasn't just answering a question anymore. She was rewriting the story. The air in the chamber was still humming from Crockett's takedown, data-driven, clean, undeniable. But J.D. Vance wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. His hands moved with purpose, now flipping through a well-marked binder, resting beside his mic. With a subtle clearing of his throat, he lifted a thick printout, the Heritage Foundation logo sharp at the top. His eyes, narrow and deliberate, scanned the room like a man about to rewrite the script. "That's a lovely display," he said, voice laced with restrained smugness. "But I came prepared too." The screen behind him didn't change, but the tone of the hearing did. "See, while total contribution might look impressive," he continued, holding up a highlighted paragraph, "output doesn't equal burden." He let the words drop like stones. His allies behind him shifted in their seats, ready charged. He didn't pause. "What matters is per capita burden, how much the average person contributes, not just the top 5 CEOs in a zip code." He gestured broadly, as if sweeping away Crockett's entire presentation with one motion. Then his focus turned razor sharp. He stabbed a finger toward the glowing outline of California still visible on the screen. "Your state is rich because of billionaire." He said the words slow and scornful. "Mine survives on workers." The line dropped like a match in dry grass. The Republican side stirred with low grumbles of agreement. Someone let out a chuckle. Aides behind him nodded, as if he'd just landed the first real punch. Vance's confidence swelled with every second of silence that followed. While your donors fly in private jets, my people build their runways, he added, voice rising slightly. They drive the trucks, fix the roads, staff the power plants. And somehow you think we owe you a thank you card? The camera caught him leaning back, relaxed, letting the words hang his posture, signaling a man convinced he just unraveled his opponent. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Not a single twitch in her expression. Her gaze remained anchored not on the screen, not on the data, but on J.D. Vance himself, like someone staring through a lie waiting to collapse under its own weight. When she spoke, her voice was calm, deliberate, almost surgical. No, she said, letting the word cut the tension in half. Then she paused, let the silence do its damage before leaning slightly into the mic. Your state isn't surviving, it's siphoning. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every syllable landed like cold iron on tile. Your people are working hard. I'm not denying that. She acknowledged her tone, cutting deeper with reason than with rage. What I'm saying is my state is being bled out, so yours can afford to keep lazy policy alive. The shift in the room was instant. Vance's smirk began to falter, and the quiet behind him turned uneasy. Crockett wasn't shouting. She was dissecting. Not lazy people, she clarified, her voice now firmer, sharper. Lazy leadership. Lazy tax codes. Lazy refusal to modernize. The words hit like calculated strikes, each one building on the last. While my constituents fund national infrastructure, yours are trapped under lawmakers too scared to raise revenue without turning it into a culture war. No one dared interrupt. Not this time. Not after the room had seen her turn numbers into a mirror. The chamber wasn't just quiet, it was captive. Crockett's eyes never left Vance's. She leaned back just enough to breathe, then delivered the final sentence, not shouted, not rushed, but with the kind of clarity that hits like a slow, clean blade. We don't get rich off billionaires. We get robbed by broken systems that protect you from telling your voters the truth. The tension didn't break, it ignited. Crockett's final line had hit like a slow detonation, and Vance, cornered and unwilling to yield, snapped back with force. He cut across her next sentence, refusing to let her reclaim the floor. She returned in kind, her tone sharpened by restraint, slicing into his words with unwavering precision. Their voices overlapped, two blades clashing midair. The room, already stretched taut, began to unravel. Order, the chair demanded, gavel striking once, then again louder, the second time. Neither flinched. Vance leaned forward, eyes hard, jaw tight. You represent a district that begs for money just to stay alive, he growled. No metaphor, no polish, just raw accusation. His allies shifted in their seats, some startled, some satisfied, as if the mask had finally come off. Crockett didn't react with fury. She didn't flinch or retreat. Instead, she turned her full gaze toward Vance, measured, unmoved, like someone watching a blade dull itself on stone. Her voice was calm, exact, and final. We don't beg, she said, letting each word fall clean and heavy into the silence. Then she paused, not for effect, but for weight. We get robbed. And just like that, the chamber fell still. Not a paper shuffled, not a breath exhaled. The words hung in the air, not loud, but louder than anything that had come before. They weren't just a rebuttal, they were a reckoning. A staffer across the room slowly lowered their phone. Reporters leaned in. Even the chair hand still resting on the gavel looked up in startled pause. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She sat back composed while the room processed the difference between asking and surviving what had been taken. The silence that had settled moments before was not peace, it was pressure. Crockett's last line still lingered in the air, like the trail of smoke after a controlled demolition. Her words had landed not as a soundbite, but as a reckoning, and the chamber felt it. J.D. Vance did too. But unlike the others, he didn't freeze. He moved deliberately, methodically, like someone searching for dry powder in a room full of sparks. He reached into the inner sleeve of his binder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was unmarked except for the discrete blacked-out lines at the top and a header internal memo. Harris County Ops, not for public release. It wasn't a policy paper or statistical summary. It was ammunition. He tapped the mic once, not seeking attention, but demanding control, and began speaking before the chair could reassert order. "Since we're talking about robbery," he said, his tone clipped and sterile, "let's talk about this." He held the paper up for effect high enough that reporters could see the stark formatting and the words beneath it. No graphics, no colors, just words. Internal memo from Harris County Office of Public Safety. He read, eyes skimming the page with surgical rhythm. Quote, "Due to rising incidents and strained resources, several counties across Texas are submitting requests for increased federal security aid." The last word, aid, landed with a faint hiss of satisfaction. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The delivery was clean, cold, and loaded. A few seats down, one Republican aide leaned in and whispered, "Is that real?" Another nodded. No one questioned where it came from. No one dared. The idea was already planted. If Vance had been losing ground, he had just dug in a spike. But it wasn't the memo that made the air tighten. It was what he said next. Vance placed the paper flat on the table and pushed it forward slightly as though offering a final exhibit to the jury. "So while Congresswoman Crockett lectures this committee about who's getting robbed," he said, lifting his gaze to meet hers, "her own districts are quietly asking for more federal help." He let that linger for half a second, just long enough for the cameras to catch the tension rising in his jaw. Then he leaned back with the ease of someone rehearsed in the politics of disdain. "I call that textbook hypocrisy." The word stung, not because it was clever, but because it was designed to poison. He didn't yell it. He didn't need to. The sentence was a weapon aimed not just at Crockett, but at everyone listening, the press, the viewers at home, even moderate Democrats watching from the sidelines. One of the Republican senators behind him muttered an audible, "Exactly." Another cracked a faint, knowing smile. They thought it was a win, a reversal, the moment Vance had needed to reclaim ground. But Crockett didn't so much as shift in her chair. She didn't grab for the mic or her folder or the monitor. Her hands stayed folded calmly on the table. Her eyes, steady, piercing, never left Vance's face. And when she spoke, her voice was neither wounded nor angry. It was precise, cold, and terrifying in its restraint. "You just proved my point," she said, not even bothering to lean in. The volume was low, but the silence was so total the room may as well have been vacuum sealed. "You just read out loud that we need protection." It wasn't a counterattack. It was a surgical reversal. She turned her body ever so slightly now, facing the full committee, not just Vance. Her tone stayed the same, even measured, unflinching. "And why do we need it?" she asked, hands still resting unmoved. "Because your economic policies, your refusal to invest in infrastructure, to close tax loopholes, to treat our communities as worth more than political footballs, made us need it." A few heads turned. A journalist in the second row paused mid-keystroke. It was no longer just a debate. It was a confession by accusation. And Crockett was making Vance hold the mirror. She didn't raise her voice, but every word landed with the weight of a closing door. "You want to talk about hypocrisy," she said, locking eyes with him again. "How about starving someone for years and then mocking them when they ask for water?" The image cut through the room like a blade through fabric. It wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about the cruelty of engineered desperation, about policies that cripple then punish, about a nation where the hands that build are forced to beg and then are called parasites for doing so. The room was completely still. One of the C-SPAN cameras zoomed in, framing Crockett's face, composed but coiled like a woman who'd long passed the need to shout. In that frozen moment, she wasn't defending a district. She was indicting a system. And J.D. Vance, for all his polish and paper, had walked her straight into the opening to do it. He looked back at her, but something in his eyes had changed. Not panic, not fear, but calculation, the slow recognition that what he'd just said, what he had thought was a blow, had exposed something far worse than weakness. It had confirmed complicity. The chair didn't move. No one did. Even the aides at the back, who were usually the first to scroll and whisper and shuffle through papers, were still. Crockett's final line. "How about starving someone for years and then mocking them when they ask for water?" wasn't just an answer. It was the kind of statement that rewrites a hearing's purpose. That takes a fact and turns it into a human wound, one you can't unsee. And for a few heavy seconds, all J.D. Vance could do was sit there and own it. The sting of her last words, starving someone for years and then mocking them when they asked for water, hadn't just hit the chamber. It had carved through it. It didn't drift away like most political barbs. It hung there heavy and unmovable, like a bell still ringing long after the mallet was dropped. And yet Jasmine Crockett didn't stop to absorb the moment. She didn't lean into the silence like a victor. She didn't need to. Instead, with the same stillness that had defined her every move, she calmly reached toward the red folder. Her fingers were controlled, her posture unchanged. No flourish, no urgency. Just the motion of someone who knew exactly what she was about to unleash and exactly when to unleash it. She slid open the flap, revealing a stack of neatly organized documents with color-coded tabs and embossed agency seals. Not for show, for precision. She extracted a single set of pages, stiff, pristine, clinical, and handed them to the clerk with a nod. "Let's stop pretending this is about feelings," she said, her voice steady, cold, unbothered. "Let's look at the facts you keep dodging." She didn't turn to look at Vance. She didn't raise her voice, but something in her tone made people lean in. As the digital display flickered to life behind her, a new kind of electricity pulsed through the room, not noise but anticipation. The screen faded from blue to black, then filled with color. 2 columns, 10 years of data. The logo of the GAO Government Accountability Office sat stamped in the corner like a federal watermark of truth. The title across the top, stark in its neutrality: Federal Contribution versus Disbursement by State 10-Year Aggregate Analysis. The data didn't shout, it didn't glow, but it commanded. The left column lit up first states marked in red, not just politically but literally: Kentucky, Alabama, Mississippi, West Virginia. Each had a thick, towering bar that reached upward like a red flag on a battlefield. Above them, white text stood out against the heat map color: 125% average return on federal tax contributions, meaning for every dollar they paid in, they received more than $1 back. Then the right column, blue states: California, New York, Illinois, Massachusetts. Their bars were notably shorter, contained, modest. The returns floated just beneath the national line. In small but brutal typeface, each state's refund ratio was labeled 93%, 89%, 84%, and beneath the entire column, average return, 84, 93%. The numbers said everything, and Crockett let them speak. She didn't launch into a monologue. She simply stepped aside, her shadow no longer blocking the screen. She stood off to the side of the projection, her face turned slightly toward the data, like a lawyer letting the evidence breathe before delivering the closing argument. And in that moment, the room wasn't just watching, it was reckoning. Crockett finally turned back to Vance, slow, deliberate, and said, "We don't beg. We don't ask for charity. We pay and then get less back." Her tone was unchained, no dramatics, no vocal emphasis. But it cut deeper than any shout. It didn't demand attention, it owned it. And then came the line that fell not like a blow, but like a sentence, a ruling, a truth that couldn't be ignored, spun or softened. "We don't eat from your hand," she said. "We get handed debt." She didn't deliver it with a pause for applause. She didn't look around for cameras. She didn't smile. She unleashed it, clean, surgical, devastating. And the effect was instant. The air collapsed inward. A hush fell, not like a polite pause, but like an implosion. The gallery stopped shifting in their seats. Reporters froze mid-keystroke. Aides held their breath. Even the chair, who had spent the better part of the hour trying to wrangle the floor back from chaos, remained motionless, his hand now resting lightly on the gavel, as if unsure whether to use it. It was the kind of silence that didn't invite response. It forbade it. No one laughed. No one interrupted. Because the truth didn't just land. It owned the room. And for the first time, J.D. Vance moved, but not forward, not upward. He shifted in his seat, slow and uncomfortable, as if his chair had suddenly turned to ice beneath him. His jaw, tense, no longer relaxed. His eyes squinted at the screen, scanning not for context, but for escape. He leaned ever so slightly toward the monitor, as if proximity might soften what the numbers refused to hide. There was no flaw, no asterisk, no footnote that could save him. The very red states he had called self-reliant were in black and white arithmetic net dependence. And the blue states he had shamed were net underwriters. The confidence he had carried earlier, the smirk, the poise, the leaning back in his chair like he owned the table, began to crumble in silence. The facts hadn't just undermined his argument. They had flipped it upside down and nailed it to the wall. There was no way to walk it back, no quip to neutralize it. It wasn't red versus blue anymore. It wasn't ideology. It was math. And math doesn't blink, it doesn't spin, and it never lies. The screen still glowed with the quiet violence of fact. Crockett stood motionless, the room subdued beneath the weight of numbers that refused to soften or spin. But silence is rarely tolerated long in a place like Congress, especially by a man who knows his argument is bleeding. J.D. Vance leaned in suddenly, his chair creaking with urgency, not anger, not panic, but something colder, calculation. He adjusted the microphone with an audible click and narrowed his eyes toward the clerk's desk. "I want to verify the source," he said, the words landing not as a request, but as a demand. "These figures, this GAO graph, who submitted it? What's the primary source?" The words were sharp-clipped, meant to throw a shadow over what had just blazed too brightly for his comfort. His tone wasn't accusatory. It was bureaucratic, a last resort from someone who just watched the walls close in. Around him, Republican aides whispered to one another, trying to find a foothold. The chair, stone-faced, nodded to the clerk without a word. A beat passed, then another. The air tensed again, not with confrontation, but with the chilling quiet of process. The clerk, unshaken, flipped through the still-open red folder that now sat on the procedural evidence stand. His fingers moved slowly, deliberately brushing past clearly labeled tabs. Fiscal summaries and government seals. Then he found it, a packet stamped in black ink with 3 emblems, GAO, CBO, and the Department of the Treasury. Without looking up, he adjusted his glasses and leaned into his mic. "The source of the data is the U.S. Department of the Treasury," he said, calm and clear, his voice echoing through the chamber. 10-year aggregate compiled in conjunction with the GO. It has been verified through the Congressional Budget Office for fiscal hearings. The effect was immediate, not dramatic but suffocating. No shouts, no gasps, just the cold thud of inevitability. Across the room, a Republican senator, gray-haired, once firm in posture, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His hand hovered near his mic, hesitating as if weighing consequences. Then slowly he leaned forward and pressed the button. His voice, when it came, was quiet but unmistakable. "I'd like my prior statement of support to be withdrawn from the record." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The silence that followed said more than applause ever could. The stenographer paused only for a heartbeat, then resumed typing. One line erased, a fracture in the shield. And through it all, Crockett didn't move. She didn't smirk. She didn't so much as glance at Vance. Her face remained still serious, not triumphant, but resolute. Her hands were folded gently on the desk. Her eyes didn't seek out the cameras. They stayed locked on the front of the chamber, as if this wasn't about him, as if it never had been. Then slowly she leaned forward, placing just enough weight on her words to make them permanent. "Sometimes," she said, voice soft but steady, "telling the truth is the most painful way to be heard." The words didn't strike like lightning. They didn't need to. They settled low, deep, final. A closing chord in a symphony that hadn't asked for permission, but left no room for denial. And no one in that room, not even J.D. Vance, could look away. The silence in the hearing room hadn't just held it, had spilled. It crept under doorways, seeped into hallways, slid through fiber optic lines, and into every device still tuned into the broadcast. It was the kind of silence that didn't imply a pause, it implied aftermath. But even as that moment still hung suspended in Washington, something began happening far beyond the Capitol dome. Something the cameras inside the chamber couldn't capture because it wasn't within the room anymore. It was leaving it. One by one, without warning or fanfare, the conservative media channels began pulling the plug. The first to blink was Newsmax, which cut suddenly from Crockett's display to a talking head panel already in mid-sentence, clearly pre-recorded, clearly inserted last minute. Then OAN with its bright red lower third reading back to regular programming, as if a car crash had interrupted the weather. Finally, Fox News. The anchor hesitated for just a second, his hand clearly frozen on the earpiece as a producer barked in his ear before the feed was yanked and replaced with a commercial for mutual funds. There was no on-air justification, no summary, just absence. The kind of silence that isn't quiet but strategic. They weren't broadcasting truth, they were protecting narratives. But not everyone had the luxury of looking away. On YouTube, the Senate's raw, unfiltered live stream surged with life. The live viewer count, which had hovered steadily around 2 million earlier in the hearing, now rocketed upward past 5.4 million, then 6.8. By the time Crockett's final phrase, "We don't beg, we get robbed," rolled out like the last note of a national indictment, the counter had passed 8.9 million. A peak, a phenomenon, a digital courtroom where no one could look away. And then something even more powerful happened. People didn't just watch, they shared. Twitter lit up like a fuse line. It started with a single clip video, a 10-second segment, posted by a college student in Atlanta, time-stamped and raw, no caption, but the words burned into the audio. Then came another, this time with subtitles from a journalist in Arizona. Then someone added the quote as white text over a black background, cutting back to Crockett's face as she spoke. The phrase traveled like lightning, not viral, not trendy. Urgent. "We don't beg, we get robbed." It wasn't just retweeted, it was claimed. Within minutes, the quote had been reposted by educators, nurses, veterans, factory workers, and undocumented organizers. A single mother in East St. Louis tweeted it over a picture of her 2 jobs combined schedule. A teenager in the Bronx posted it next to a photo of their school's crumbling ceiling. A mechanic in coal country, someone who would likely never vote for Crockett, still shared the clip with the words, "She's not wrong." On TikTok, the quote took new form. A teacher in Detroit layered it over a montage of failing infrastructure and missing textbooks. A paramedic in rural Alabama stitched the video into a story about 3 unpaid 24-hour shifts in a station without running water. One video simply showed an EBT receipt rejected with Crockett's voice echoing behind it like a ghost in a grocery aisle. The words weren't just being repeated, they were lived. Because the truth she had spoken wasn't abstract. It wasn't partisan. It was personal. This wasn't political theater. It was a rupture. And Crockett hadn't just pierced through the illusion, she had held it up to the light and let America see its own shadow. Even Reddit, normally a minefield of anonymous cynicism, began to flood with discussion threads. In one, a retired Army staff sergeant wrote, "That woman just said what I felt for 20 years. In another, a self-identified libertarian commented, "You know it's bad when you realize your state takes more than it gives, and you've been taught to call them the leeches." And still the line echoed, "We don't beg, we get robbed." It was more than defiance. It was a confession America didn't want to hear and couldn't unhear once it did. Somewhere in a newsroom, a producer scrambled to edit a panel segment too late. The audience had already seen what mattered. Somewhere in a congressional office, a coims team debated issuing a statement too slow. The clip had already spread through 11 million views. The power had moved. The room that Crockett stood in no longer contained the debate. It merely sparked it. And the flame was being carried by strangers who had never heard her name before this morning, but now were sharing it like gospel. Back in the Capitol, the hearing continued. But outside those walls, something irreversible had already begun. A phrase had crossed state lines without stopping. And it didn't carry a party line. It carried a reckoning. A reckoning that asked if we don't beg, but we're still empty-handed. Then who's really stealing from who? And across millions of screens, someone hit play again. Watching Crockett's eyes hold steady, her voice unmoved as she said it once more, with all the weight of a century behind it. "We don't beg, we get robbed." The digital inferno outside the Capitol was still climbing 8.9 million, watching live hashtags multiplying by the minute. But inside the hearing room, the atmosphere felt like the stillness before a second explosion. Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. Her opponent had faltered, the media had fractured, but the moment demanded more than a stumble. It demanded memory, it demanded reckoning, and that's what she brought with her next move. Not a soundbite, not a retort, but a storm of numbers, facts, and unanswered cries from disaster zones America had already tried to forget. With the flick of her wrist, slow and deliberate, she reached into the battered red folder, now a character in its own right, and withdrew a new document. The edges were laminated, polished, and battle-worn all at once. She didn't hold it up for effect. She didn't need to. The moment she placed it flat on the table and nudged it toward the clerk, cameras zoomed in, instinctively sensing another shift in the gravitational center of the room. Across the top, bold and unmistakable Federal Emergency Management Agency. Budget Allocation Report, Hurricane Relief, 2017-2020. Crockett's voice remained steady, not cold, not theatrical, just precise. Let's talk about what happens when the storm actually hits. The words settled into the marble and mahogany around her like a slow-acting chemical. The room stilled. Staffers paused their typing. A few senators leaned forward not out of courtesy but out of the anxious anticipation that comes when someone brings the receipts that history tried to bury. The projection screen blinked and filled with a two-column display. On the left, Hurricane Harvey, Texas 2017. A Category 4 storm that dumped over 60 inches of rain, caused widespread flooding, displaced over 30,000 people, and destroyed more than 300,000 structures. The death toll, 107 souls. Below the statistics, a single stark line, $7.4 billion, allocated by FEMA in the aftermath. To the right, Hurricane Irma, Florida 2017. Another catastrophic storm, yes, but the damage was lower, more contained. The human toll, while painful, had not reached Texas levels, and yet the number listed beneath was nearly double, $14.8 billion allocated. No commentary, no scrolling animation, just side-by-side injustice displayed in sterile federal font, made more brutal by the lack of excuses. Then a red line slowly crawled across the screen, connecting both figures, like a scar that refused to close. Beneath it, in bold black letters, Texas received 52% of Florida's total relief, with 162% greater infrastructure loss. The line wasn't an opinion. It was a wound that spoke for itself. Jasmine didn't move. She let the data breathe, let it crawl across the consciousness of every person seated before her. J.D. Vance no longer looked smug. He wasn't checking his notes. He was locked in place, eyes narrowed, the corners of his jaw twitching ever so slightly as the math settled in. Only then did she speak. Not to the room, not to the cameras, but to him. Her tone didn't change. It didn't have to. "If you all really fund my state," she asked, her voice as calm as a storm's eye, "then where were you when we needed a hand?" And those 17 words hit like a gavel, shattering glass. The room didn't gasp. It collapsed into something worse, a silence that exposed everyone. It wasn't rhetorical. It was historical. Because every policymaker, every budget line, every backroom deal that had left communities gasping for aid was suddenly on trial. The silence wasn't the kind that waited to be filled. It was the kind that convicted. A Republican aide dropped their pen and didn't reach for it. Another adjusted his tie out of nervous instinct, not discomfort. The gallery froze. The staffers behind Vance didn't blink. Because this wasn't just a policy point anymore, it was an indictment. And Crockett stood at the center, not as a witness, but as the prosecutor of a forgotten wound. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't add flourish. Her restraint was more commanding than rage could ever be. She allowed the reality of those figures to scrape across the collective conscience of the room like wind through a broken window. Her hand never moved from the table. Her eyes never wavered from Vance's. She wasn't debating him anymore. She was holding him accountable for something far older than this chamber selective mercy. J.D. Vance's posture shifted subtly but undeniably. His shoulders rose slightly, not out of offense but defense. His lips parted as if to speak but stopped. He reached for his notes, then stopped again. The weight on his chest wasn't Crockett's tone. It was the timeline of disaster she had just unpacked. He had come prepared for a budget battle. He had not come prepared to explain why, in the hours after one of the worst storms in modern history, his party's grip on power had meant Texas got half the help for twice the suffering. There was no pie chart that could neutralize that, no tax theory, no per capita burden. Just a truth that had stood in the rain for years, waiting for someone to say it on the record. And Crockett had said it, out loud, on camera, to his face. And now the storm wasn't in Texas anymore. It was in this room, and no one could look away. The storm inside the chamber was no longer on Crockett's shoulders. It had passed to J.D. Vance, and everyone could feel it. The red folder had been closed, but its weight remained like the aftershock of a hammer dropped on glass. Every fact had landed. Every number had cut. Every argument had been folded and put to rest beneath the blinding contrast of FEMA's biased Giles audits and a reality too clear to dismiss. The walls no longer felt like they were holding sound. They were holding something heavier, a reckoning that couldn't be spun. Crockett didn't say another word. She didn't have to. She had built a cathedral of data, compassion, and sharp-edged truth and dared anyone to knock it down. But across the room, J.D. Vance wasn't reading charts anymore. He wasn't pointing at screens. He sat with his hands folded before him, not in authority, but in stalling, like a man trying to dig a foundation in sand. The silence that followed was no longer suspenseful. It was damning. That's when Vance finally leaned forward, his voice emerging low and oddly calm, as if trying to reclaim something that had already slipped through his fingers. He didn't look at the screen, didn't reference a source, didn't gesture toward any stack of papers. He simply exhaled and said, "I still believe in an honest America, one that isn't ruled by numbers." The words fell like chalk on wet pavement. Soft, uncertain, a retreat disguised as principle. But the air didn't move. No one clapped, no one nodded, because everyone in that room knew exactly what had just happened. A man with no more data had chosen sentiment over substance, emotion over accountability, a flag of feeling where the facts had already drawn their map. But Crockett didn't roll her eyes. She didn't even smile. She just slowly turned her body graceful, patient, until she faced him fully again. Her fingers rested gently on the lip of her folder, but she didn't open it. She didn't need to. The red had already done its work. She took a breath, deliberate and controlled, and said softly but clearly, "I believe in a fair America. And fairness begins with the truth." 9 words. And yet they cut through the air like a siren through fog. The contrast was brutal. Not because she raised her voice, but because she didn't have to. Her words rang with the kind of gravity that only comes when every statistic, every storm, every silence has already done the speaking. It was not a quote designed to trend. It was a line crafted for history. And the room changed. The power didn't shift with volume or interruption, but with moral velocity. Crockett wasn't arguing anymore. She was witnessing, standing not just for her constituents, but for every working family who had ever been told they were a burden by people who had never had to fight for recovery funds, stand in floodwater, or rebuild a home from a foundation of rot and injustice. The cameras zoomed closer, but the frame couldn't hold the weight of what had just happened. Crockett's calm wasn't passive. It was precise. She stood with the strength of someone who didn't win by outshouting, but by outlasting the lie. Vance shifted again, trying to adjust his body as if that would adjust the outcome. But there were no charts left, no talking points untouched. He had made his final appeal not to facts, but to nostalgia. And nostalgia was bleeding out. The chair of the hearing didn't move. The room didn't stir. Even aides weren't typing. Because that was the moment the mask of ideology cracked. And behind it stood a woman who had walked into the room with nothing but a red folder and a nameplate, and walked out with something far heavier, truth that could not be retracted. The silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable, it was total. Not a rebuttal, not a challenge, not even a procedural objection. Only air and the feeling that something irreversible had just occurred. Because while J.D. Vance tried to sell belief, Jasmine Crockett had delivered proof. And proof always outlasts belief, especially when it's printed, verified, and echoed by the very government his side claimed to defend. She didn't gloat. She didn't sneer. She simply let the line echo. Fairness begins with the truth. It was the kind of line that doesn't trend. Because it's clever, it trends because it ends something. And everyone in that room, whether they admitted it or not, knew exactly what had just ended. The silence inside the chamber was no longer just a pause, it had become evidence. J.D. Vance's final appeal to faith over facts had landed with a dull thud, swallowed by the weight of Crockett's calm, data-laced truth. The hearing adjourned not with ceremony, but with unease, like a dam cracking beneath the weight of what could no longer be denied. Outside, the storm had already begun. Within 24 minutes, newsrooms lit up across the country. Reporters didn't wait for statements. They didn't need spin. The footage itself had become the story. By the time Crockett stepped off Capitol Hill, the Washington Post, CNN, Politico, and Bloomberg had already replaced their homepage leads. The headline that crossed every masthead was nearly identical: Crockett versus Vance, who really pays for America. It wasn't a partisan question anymore. It was a national reckoning, one that millions of viewers had just witnessed with their own eyes. Side-by-side clips flooded social media timelines. On one side, J.D. Vance leaning forward saying, "I still believe in an honest America, one that isn't ruled by numbers." On the other, Jasmine Crockett, unwavering, her voice steady as a blade, "I believe in a fair America. And fairness begins with the truth." The juxtaposition was lethal. It wasn't just a debate, it was an ideological X-ray laying bare who was prepared to govern with facts and who was trying to govern with feelings. Within hours, something rare happened, a fracture in the business class, and this time it didn't favor the usual donors. In Manhattan, the New York Chamber of Commerce issued a joint statement with Silicon Valley business leaders, praising Crockett for her clarity and courage in correcting what they called a dangerous false narrative about tax burdens and federal dependence. In Los Angeles, tech executives from companies like Tesla, Salesforce, and Adobe began sharing data visualizations, echoing the exact numbers Crockett had used, down to the GAO sourcing. The message was clear, even from those who rarely got involved in raw politics. They were done being blamed for carrying the weight of the federal budget. One CEO tweeted simply, "We don't need gratitude, but we're tired of being told we're freeloaders while footing the bill." Attached was a clip of Crockett's now iconic line, "We don't beg, we get robbed." It had already been viewed 11 million times, but the real shock came from the people. Within 6 hours of the hearing, Ipsos released a flash poll conducted on YouTube X, formerly Twitter, in CNN's mobile app. Over 67% of respondents across party lines agreed that blue states contribute more to the federal system than they receive in return. Even in traditionally red districts, rural Arkansas, northern Georgia, and the Ohio River Valley, support for Crockett's framing outpaced expectations. A third of self-identified conservatives said the data gave them pause about how aid was framed by Republican leaders. The narrative had slipped, and this time, the truth wasn't being silenced. News anchors long practiced at couching coverage in neutrality now spoke in tones tinged with urgency. MSNBC ran a segment titled "Who Really Funds?" America's Backbone, CBS's Sunday morning panel, showed side-by-side FEMA recovery maps with federal disbursements overlaid and asked aloud what so many had been whispering for years. Are red states weaponizing victimhood while draining the very system they demonize? The framing had changed. No longer was it welfare versus work. Now it was redistribution versus responsibility. And Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a representative from Texas. She had become something else entirely, a mirror that made the country look at itself. As the news cycle surged, a behind-the-scenes clip leaked from the Hill's press corridor, Crockett walking past a Fox News crew, declining an interview but heard saying softly to an aide, "They're going to keep asking who we think we are. I say it's time we tell them." That soundbite too went viral. The backlash was predictable but muted. Conservative commentators tried to reframe her tone as divisive, but even they couldn't argue with the math. They avoided the GAO charts. They didn't show the FEMA bar graphs. They focused instead on Crockett's delivery, abrasive, confrontational, angry, but every time they tried to dismiss her, the numbers kept resurfacing. And those numbers weren't hers to invent. They belonged to the U.S. Treasury, the Congressional Budget Office, and the Government Accountability Office. They were federal. They were factual, and they were fatal to the myth that red states subsidize blue ones. Even political independents, often silent on these issues, began weighing in. One viral post from a retired Army colonel read, "I served in Iraq. I also pay taxes in New Jersey. My son is a teacher in Texas. And let me tell you, Crockett is right. The system is upside down, and it's been bleeding quietly for years." The cultural mood had changed. This wasn't just a political skirmish. It was the start of a national audit. In classrooms, civic groups, and local news debates, one question kept coming back like a drumbeat. If the blue states stopped paying, what would be left? That question, sharp, simple, and once unthinkable, was no longer hypothetical. It was on the table. And Crockett, with nothing but a red folder and righteous restraint, had forced the country to ask it. The storm didn't end with thunder. It ended with silence. Not the silence of confusion, but the kind that follows revelation. The kind that settles in rooms too heavy with truth to breathe. Jasmine Crockett's voice had landed not like a gavel, but like a final heartbeat in a chamber that had just seen itself clearly in the mirror. There will come a day, she said, her tone calm and unshaking, when America stops measuring itself in political colors and starts measuring in truth, in whose hands are building and whose hands are taking. The sentence hung in the air like a suspended blade, not a threat, a warning, a plea, a truth too long avoided finally spoken in a room built to avoid it. Her eyes didn't flicker with pride or vengeance. They locked forward with the patience of someone who had carried these numbers for years, waiting for the moment when the evidence would stop being ignored and start cutting through. There was no stammer from the other side, no rebuttal offered. Not because they lacked words, but because they no longer had footing. For over an hour, J.D. Vance had thrown every deflection, every talking point, every symbol he could grasp into the fire. Moralism, regional pride per capita, burden-old stereotypes dressed up as patriotism. And yet now, stripped to the data, he sat, watching a reality he couldn't recode, etched in federal figures and projected for the nation. The camera tightened its focus. Crockett's face was framed cleanly in the center of the shot eyes, sharp posture, still not a wrinkle of hesitation in her brow. This wasn't the face of someone trying to win applause. It was the face of someone carrying the cost of being dismissed and distorted, then rising through it one ledger line at a time. Behind her, the screen changed. One last time. No dramatic transitions, no colors engineered to provoke. Just two columns like ledgers on opposite sides of a nation's checkbook. No debate, no margin of error, just a mathematical confession. Crockett said nothing more. She didn't need to. Her quote, already posted across social media, already clipped by late-night producers, was still pulsing through the public bloodstream. We don't beg. We don't ask for charity. We pay and then get less back. We don't eat from your hand. We get handed debt. She had turned a hearing into a ledger into a confrontation, and a confrontation into an indictment. Not just of J.D. Vance, but of the decades-long myth that prosperity flowed downhill from red to blue, when the truth was the opposite had been subsidizing the illusion all along. And then the most powerful moment of the entire hearing arrived: complete stillness. The Republican side didn't move. Even Vance, once so quick to interject, sat motionless, staring not at Crockett, but at the numbers glowing on the screen behind her, like the last thing seen before an execution. His jaw locked, a flicker of his eye uncertain, not broken, but cornered by something unshakable. The moderator cleared his throat. No one responded. Then the camera panned slowly back to the screen. The final frame of the hearing: top 5 tax donors, shucks blue states. Top 5 federal aid receivers, shucks red states. The implication was so stark it didn't need language. It felt like the closing scene of a legal drama, one where the verdict was never spoken, only understood. A courtroom without a jury. A confession made through silence. Crockett leaned back in her chair, fingers finally releasing the red folder she'd carried from the first minute. She didn't nod. She didn't look around for reaction. She simply let go, as if the burden of proving what should have been obvious was no longer hers to carry. Across the country, screens lit up in newsrooms and living rooms. CNN's breaking banner changed to bold white Crockett versus Vance, who really pays for America. Politico posted a headline that read, "Red hands, blue wallets, the data that shook the chamber." The Washington Post ran a full-width top banner. Crockett drops the numbers and the illusions. And while legacy networks played catch-up, millions online had already made up their minds. In California and New York, business leaders who typically avoided partisan noise issued public endorsements not for a party, but for the clarity they had seen in her. CEOs, labor unions, even several state governors began circulating Crockett's final graph, some demanding it be taught in high school economics classes. It became a digital flashpoint in real time. On YouTube and Twitter, live stream views surpassed 9 million concurrent watchers. Clips of Crockett's most powerful line, "We don't eat from your hand, we get handed debt," were remixed into short reels, turned into protest signs, screen printed on t-shirts by midnight. And then just when it seemed the energy might taper off, a poll dropped conducted just 2 hours after the hearing ended. 67% of respondents said they now believe blue states contribute more than they receive. Even 41% of Republican voters admitted the numbers were hard to deny. Truth had broken the algorithm, and this time it didn't come with an apology. Inside the hearing room, it ended without cheers. No gavel slam, no eruption, just a screen frozen on that last chart. A woman seated in quiet resolve, and a country now forced to ask who builds America and who bleeds it. The silence in the hearing chamber didn't mark the end of a debate, it marked the beginning of an awakening. As screens across the country froze on that final chart, as Crockett's voice still echoed in fragments across live streams, something deeper than policy began to stir. Not just outrage, not just vindication, something more elemental: recognition. Recognition that the American divide had never truly been about red versus blue, north versus south, urban versus rural. It had been about truth and who gets to tell it, about labor and who gets rewarded for it, about sacrifice and who gets forgotten despite it. And in that chamber before the nation, Jasmine Crockett hadn't just exposed a fiscal lie, she had exposed a moral one. Because beneath the numbers, beyond the charts, and past every exchange between Crockett and Vance, the story had always been larger than them. It was the story of janitors in Detroit who paid more in payroll tax than billionaires in Palm Beach. The story of nurses in Houston working double shifts while getting blamed for needing federal help. It was the story of parents in Oakland watching their schools close while being told their state was draining the country. And it was the story of people who build, who serve, who give more than they receive, being told to be grateful for less. Crockett understood this not because it was in her binder, but because it was in her blood. She had walked the districts that J.D. Vance reduced to deficits. She had sat with single mothers whose entire month's groceries were bought with the same tax dollars that got diverted to highway funds in states that demonized them. She had seen what America looked like when it pretended to be fair, but operated like a rigged casino where the house always wins and the house is built in someone else's name. So when she spoke of truth, she wasn't making a speech. She was making an accusation, and beneath it a plea. That plea wasn't for applause. It wasn't even for J.D. Vance. It was for every person who had ever been told that their hard work wasn't enough because their zip code didn't vote the right color. For every child who grew up in underfunded neighborhoods, told their state was wealthy, yet watched their streetlights flicker out by 9 p.m. For every blue-collar worker who paid into a system they never saw return. Crockett's message was unpolished, unbranded, unfiltered. And that's what made it powerful. It wasn't trying to sell unity, it was demanding justice. Because at its core, her confrontation with Vance wasn't about tax returns. It was about dignity, about whose labor counts, about who gets erased in national narratives written by think tanks that never leave D.C. It was about reclaiming the truth, not just from politicians, but from the systems that had taught generations of Americans to blame the struggling rather than question the structure. And when Crockett said, "We don't ask for charity, we get handed debt," she wasn't just referring to states. She was talking about people, about communities that had been labeled broken when in fact they'd been looted of funding, of credit, of acknowledgement. And maybe that's why it hurt so deeply. Because for the first time in a long time, someone put it on the record that wealth without equity is theft. That contribution without return is exploitation. That patriotism without fairness is gaslighting. Her calm, clear voice wasn't radical, it was responsible. It was everything America claims to be on the 4th of July, but forgets to be on every other day. So what was the real lesson? That truth, when armed with courage, can still cut through the noise. That data, when matched with conviction, can become a weapon. And that sometimes the most radical thing a leader can do is tell the truth plainly, even when the truth hurts their own country's pride. Crockett never raised her voice. But in a room built to silence her, she made herself undeniable. Not through outrage, through evidence, not through shame, through reality. And in doing so, she reminded a divided nation of something it had nearly forgotten, that justice isn't a side effect of democracy, it's the point of it. That budgets aren't just spreadsheets, they're moral documents. And that the measure of a country isn't found in its slogans, but in how it treats the people who build it. As the hearing adjourned, there was no standing ovation, no confetti, no handshake across the aisle, just a truth finally spoken, finally heard. And in that moment, it became clear America doesn't need another debate. It needs a reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett just delivered its opening chapter. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.